Chapter 24. When Vronsky looked at his watch on the Karenin's balcony, he was so greatly agitated and lost in his thoughts that he saw the figures on the watch's face, but could not take in what time it was. He came out onto the high road and walked, picking his way carefully through the mud to his carriage. He was so completely absorbed in his feeling for Anna that he did not even think what o'clock it was, and whether he still had time to go to Bryansky's. He had left him, as often happens after a shock, only the external faculty of memory that points out each step one has to take, one after the other. He went up to his coachman, who was dozing on the box in the already lengthening shadows of the lime tree. He admired the shifting clouds of midges circling over the hot horses, and, waking the coachman, he jumped into the carriage and told him to drive to Bryansky's. It was only after driving nearly 5 miles that he had sufficiently recovered himself to look at his watch and realize that it was 5:30, and he was late. There were several races fixed for the day: the mounted guards race, then the officers' 1.5-mile race, then the 3-mile race, and then the race for which he was entered. He could still be in time for his race, but if he went to Bryansky's he could only just be in time, and he would arrive when the whole of the court would be in their places. That would be a pity. But he had promised Bryansky to come, and so he decided to drive on, telling the coachman not to spare the horses. He reached Bryansky's, spent 5 minutes there, and galloped back. This rapid drive calmed him. All that was painful in his relations with Anna, all the feeling of uncertainty left by their conversation, had slipped out of his mind. He was now thinking with pleasure and excitement of the race, of his being in time, and now and then the thought of the blissful interview awaiting him that night flashed across his imagination like a flaming light. The excitement of the approaching race gained upon him as he drove further and further into the atmosphere of the races, overtaking carriages driving up from the summer villas or out of Petersburg. At his quarters no one was left at home, all were at the races, and his valet was looking for him at the gate. While he was changing his clothes, his valet told him that the second race had begun already, that a lot of gentlemen had been to ask for him, and a boy had twice run up from the stables. Dressing without hurry, he never hurried himself, and he never lost his self-possession, Vronsky drove to the sheds. From the sheds he could see a perfect sea of carriages, and people on foot, soldiers surrounding the racecourse, and pavilions swarming with people. The second race was apparently going on, for just as he went into the sheds he heard a bell ringing. Going towards the stable, he met the white-legged chestnut, Mahotin's gladiator, being led to the racecourse in a blue forage horsecloth, with what looked like huge ears edged with blue. "Where's Cord?" he asked the stable boy. "In the stable, putting on the saddle." In the open horse box stood Frau, saddled and ready. They were just going to lead her out. "I'm not too late?" All right," said the Englishman. "Don't upset yourself." Vronsky once more took in one glance the exquisite lines of his favorite mare, who was quivering all over, and with an effort he tore himself from the sight of her and went out of the stable. He went towards the pavilions at the most favorable moment for escaping attention. The 1.5-mile race was just finishing, and all eyes were fixed on the horse guard in front and the light hussar behind, urging their horses on with a last effort close to the winning post. From the center and outside the ring all were crowding to the winning post, and a group of soldiers and officers of the horse guards were shouting loudly their delight at the expected triumph of their officer and comrade. Vronsky moved into the middle of the crowd unnoticed, almost at the very moment when the bell rang at the finish of the race. And the tall, mud-splattered horse guard who came in first, bending over the saddle, let go the reins of his panting gray horse that looked dark with sweat. The horse, stiffening out its legs, with an effort stopped its rapid course, and the officer of the horse guards looked round him like a man waking up from a heavy sleep, and just managed to smile. A crowd of friends and outsiders pressed round him. Vronsky intentionally avoided that select crowd of the upper world, which was moving and talking with discreet freedom before the pavilions. He knew that Madame Karenina was there, and Betsy, and his brother's wife, and he purposely did not go near them for fear of something distracting his attention. But he was continually met and stopped by acquaintances who told him about the previous races, and kept asking why he was so late. At the time when the racers had to go to the pavilion to receive the prizes, and all attention was directed to that point, Vronsky's elder brother, Alexander, a colonel, came up to him. He was not tall, though as broadly built as Alexei, and handsomer and rosier than he. He had a red nose and an open, drunken-looking face. "Did you get my note?" he said. "There's never any finding you." Alexander Vronsky, in spite of the dissolute life, and in especial the drunken habits, for which he was notorious, was quite one of the court circle. Now, as he talked to his brother of a matter bound to be exceedingly disagreeable to him, knowing that the eyes of many people might be fixed upon him, he kept a smiling countenance, as though he were jesting with his brother about something of little importance. "I got it, and I really can't make out what you are worrying yourself about," said Alexei. "I'm worrying myself because the remark has just been made to me that you weren't here, and that you were seen in Peterhof on Monday. There are matters which only concern those directly interested in them, and the matter you are so worried about is—" "Yes, but if so, you may as well cut the service. I beg you not to meddle. That's all I have to say." Alexei Vronsky's frowning face turned white, and his prominent lower jaw quivered, which happened rarely with him. Being a man of very warm heart, he was seldom angry, but when he was angry, and when his chin quivered, then, as Alexander Vronsky knew, he was dangerous. Alexander Vronsky smiled gaily. "I only wanted to give you Mother's letter. Answer it, and don't worry about anything just before the race. Good luck," he added, smiling, and he moved away from him. But after him another friendly greeting brought Vronsky to a standstill. "So, you don't recognize your own friends. How are you?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, as conspicuously brilliant in all the midst of the Petersburg brilliance as he was in Moscow, his face rosy and his whiskers sleek and glossy. "I came up yesterday. I'm delighted that I shall see your triumph. When shall we meet?" "Come tomorrow to the mess room," said Vronsky, and squeezing him by the sleeve of his coat with apologies, he moved away to the center of the race course, where the horses were being led for the great steeplechase. The horses who had run in the last race were now being led home, steaming and exhausted, by the stable boys, and one after another the fresh horses for the coming race made their appearance, for the most part English racers, wearing horsecloths and looking with their drawn-up bellies like strange, huge birds. On the right was led in Frau, lean and beautiful, lifting up her elastic, rather long pasterns, as though moved by springs. Not far from her they were taking the rug off the lop-eared gladiator, the strong, exquisite, perfectly correct lines of the stallion, with his superb hindquarters and excessively short pasterns, almost over his hoofs, attracted Vronsky's attention in spite of himself. He would have gone up to his mare, but he was again detained by an acquaintance. "Oh, there's Karenin," said the acquaintance with whom he was chatting. "He's looking for his wife, and she's in the middle of the pavilion. Didn't you see her?" "No," answered Vronsky, and without even glancing around towards the pavilion where his friend was pointing out Madame Karenina, he went up to his mare. Vronsky had not time to look at the saddle, about which he had to give some direction, when the competitors were summoned to the pavilion to receive their numbers and places in the row at starting. 17 officers, looking serious and severe, many with pale faces, met together in the pavilion and drew their numbers. Vronsky drew the number 7. The cry was heard, "Mount your horses." Feeling that with the others riding in the race, he was the center upon which all eyes were fastened, Vronsky walked up to his mare in that state of nervous tension in which he usually became deliberate and composed in his movements. Cord, in honor of the races, had put on his best clothes, a black coat buttoned up, a stiffly starched collar which propped up his cheeks, a round black hat, and top boots. He was calm and dignified as ever, and was with his own hands holding Frau Frau by both reins, and standing straight in front of her. Frau Frau was still trembling as though in a fever. The mare glanced aslant at him, drew up her lip, and twitched her ear. The Englishman puckered up his lips, intending to indicate a smile that anyone should verify his saddling. "Get up, you won't feel so excited." Vronsky looked round for the last time at his rivals. He knew that he would not see them during the race. 2 were already riding forward to the point from which they were to start. Galtzin, a friend of Vronsky's and one of his more formidable rivals, was moving round a bay horse that would not let him mount. A little light hussar in tight riding breeches rode off at a gallop, crouched up like a cat on the saddle, in imitation of English jockeys. Prince Kuzulov sat with a white face on his thoroughbred mare from the Grabovsky stud, while an English groom led her by the bridle. Vronsky and all his comrades knew Kuzulov and his weak nerves and his terrible vanity. They knew he was afraid of everything, afraid of riding a spirited horse. But now, just because it was terrible, because people broke their necks, and there was a doctor standing at each obstacle, and an ambulance with a cross on it, and a sister of mercy, he had made up his mind to take part in the race. Their eyes met, and Vronsky gave him a friendly and encouraging nod. Only one he did not see, his chief rival, Mahotin on Gladiator. "Don't be in a hurry," said Cord to Vronsky, "and remember one thing, don't hold her in at the fences, and don't urge her on. Let her go as she likes." All right," said Vronsky, taking the reins. "If you can, lead the race, but don't lose heart till the last minute, even if you're behind." Before the mare had time to move, Vronsky stepped with an agile, vigorous movement into the steel-toothed stirrup, and lightly and firmly seated himself on the creaking leather of the saddle. Getting his right foot in the stirrup, he smoothed the double reins, as he always did, between his fingers, and let Cord go. As though she did not know which foot to put first, Frau Frau started dragging at the reins with her long neck, and as though she were on springs, shaking her rider from side to side. Cord quickened his step, following him, the excited mare, trying to shake off her rider, first on one side and then on the other, pulled at the reins, and Vronsky tried in vain with voice and hand to soothe her. They were just reaching the dammed-up stream on the way to the starting point. Several of the riders were in front and several behind, when suddenly Vronsky heard the sound of a horse galloping in the mud behind him, and he was overtaken by Mahotin on his white-legged, law-beard Gladiator. Mahotin smiled, showing his long teeth, but Vronsky looked angrily at him. He did not like him, and regarded him now as his most formidable rival. He was angry with him for galloping past and exciting his mare. Frau Frau started into a gallop. Her left foot forward, made 2 bounds, and fretting at the tightened reins, passed into a jolting trot, bumping her rider up and down. Cord, too, scowled and followed Vronsky almost at a trot. Chapter 25. There were 17 officers in all riding in this race. The racecourse was a large 3-mile ring of the form of an ellipse in front of the pavilion. On this course 9 obstacles had been arranged. The stream, a big and solid barrier 5 feet high just before the pavilion, a dry ditch, a ditch full of water, a precipitous slope, an Irish barricade, one of the most difficult obstacles, consisting of a mound fenced with brushwood, beyond which was a ditch out of sight for the horses, so the horse had to clear both obstacles or might be killed. Then 2 more ditches filled with water, and 1 dry one, and the end of the race was just facing the pavilion. But the race began not in the ring, but 200 yards away from it, and in that part of the course was the first obstacle, a dammed-up stream 7 feet in breadth, which the racers could leap or wade through as they preferred. 3 times they were arranged ready to start, but each time some horse thrust itself out of line and they had to begin again. The umpire who was starting them, Colonel Sestron, was beginning to lose his temper, when at last, for the 4th time, he shouted, "Away!" and the racers started. Every eye, every opera glass, was turned on the brightly colored group of riders at the moment they were in line to start. "They're off! They're starting!" was heard on all sides after a hush of expectation. And little groups and solitary figures among the public began running from place to place to get a better view. In the very first minute the close group of horsemen drew out, and it could be seen that they were approaching the stream in 2s and 3s and one behind another. To the spectators it seemed as though they had all started simultaneously, but to the racers there were seconds of differences that had great value to them. Frau, excited and over-nervous, had lost the first moment, and several horses had started before her, but before reaching the stream, Vronsky, who was holding in the mare with all his force as she tugged at the bridle, easily overtook 3, and there were left in front of him Mahotin's chestnut Gladiator, whose hindquarters were moving lightly and rhythmically up and down exactly in front of Vronsky, and in front of all the dainty mare Diana, bearing Kuzulov, more dead than alive. For the first instant, Vronsky was not master either of himself or his mare. Up to the first obstacle, the stream, he could not guide the motions of his mare. Gladiator and Diana came up to it together, and almost at the same instant, simultaneously, they rose above the stream and flew to the other side. Frau darted after them as if flying, but at the very moment when Vronsky felt himself in the air, he suddenly saw almost under the mare's hoofs Kuzulov, who was floundering with Diana on the further side of the stream. Kuzulov had let go the reins as he took the leap, and the mare had sent him flying over her head. Those details Vronsky learned later. At that moment all he saw was that just under him, where Frau must alight, Diana's legs or head might be in the way. But Frau drew up her legs and back in the very act of leaping like a falling cat, and clearing the other mare, alighted beyond her. "Oh, the darling!" thought Vronsky. After crossing the stream, Vronsky had complete control of his mare, and began holding her in, intending to cross the great barrier behind Mahotin, and to try to overtake him in the clear ground of about 500 yards that followed it. The great barrier stood just in front of the imperial pavilion. The Tsar and the whole court and crowds of people were all gazing at them, at him, and Mahotin, a length ahead of him, as they drew near the devil, as the solid barrier was called. Vronsky was aware of those eyes fastened upon him from all sides, but he saw nothing except the ears and neck of his own mare, the ground racing to meet him, and the back and white legs of Gladiator beating time swiftly before him, keeping always the same distance ahead. Gladiator rose, with no sound of knocking against anything. With a wave of his short tail, he disappeared from Vronsky's sight. "Bravo!" cried a voice. At the same instant, under Vronsky's eyes, right before him flashed the palings of the barrier. Without the slightest change in her action, his mare flew over it, the palings vanished, and he heard only a crash behind him. The mare, excited by Gladiator's keeping ahead, had risen too soon before the barrier and grazed it with her hind hoofs. But her pace never changed, and Vronsky, feeling a splatter of mud on his face, realized that he was once more the same distance from Gladiator. Once more he perceived in front of him the same back and short tail, and again the same swiftly moving white legs that got no further away. At the very moment when Vronsky thought now was the time to overtake Mahotin, Frau herself, understanding his thoughts, without any incitement on his part, gained ground considerably, and began getting alongside of Mahotin on the most favorable side, close to the inner cord. Mahotin would not let her pass that side. Vronsky had hardly formed the thought that he could perhaps pass on the outer side, when Frau shifted her pace and began overtaking him on the other side. Frau's shoulder, beginning by now to be dark with sweat, was even with Gladiator's back. For a few lengths they moved evenly, but before the obstacle they were approaching, Vronsky began working at the reins, anxious to avoid having to take the outer circle, and swiftly passed Mahotin just upon the declivity. He caught a glimpse of the mud-stained face as he flashed by. He even fancied that he smiled. Vronsky passed Mahotin, but he was immediately aware of him close upon him, and he never ceased hearing the even thudding hoofs and the rapid and still quite fresh breathing of Gladiator. The next two obstacles, the watercourse and the barrier, were easily crossed, but Vronsky began to hear the snorting and thud of Gladiator closer upon him. He urged on his mare, and to his delight felt that she easily quickened her pace, and the thud of Gladiator's hoofs was again heard at the same distance away. Vronsky was at the head of the race, just as he wanted to be, and as Cord had advised, and now he felt sure of being the winner. His excitement, his delight, and his tenderness for Frau grew keener and keener. He longed to look around again, but he did not dare to do this, and he tried to be cool and not to urge on his mare so as to keep the same reserve of force in her as he felt that Gladiator still kept. There remained only one obstacle, the most difficult. If he could cross it ahead of the others, he would come in first. He was flying towards the Irish barricade. Frau and he both together saw the barricade in the distance, and both the man and the mare had a moment's hesitation. He saw the uncertainty in the mare's ears and lifted the whip, but at the same time felt sure that his fears were groundless. The mare knew what was wanted. She quickened her pace and rose smoothly, just as he fancied she would, and as she left the ground gave herself up to the force of her rush, which carried her far beyond the ditch, and with the same rhythm, without effort, with the same leg forward, Frau fell back into her pace again. "Bravo, Vronsky!" he heard shouts from a knot of men. He knew they were his friends in the regiment, who were standing at the obstacle. He could not fail to recognize Yashvin's voice, though he did not see him. "Oh, my sweet," he said inwardly to Frau, as he listened for what was happening behind. He's cleared it, he thought, catching the thud of Gladiator's hoofs behind him. There remained only the last ditch, filled with water and 5 feet wide. Vronsky did not even look at it, but anxious to get in a long way first, began sawing away at the reins, lifting the mare's head and letting it go in time with her paces. He felt that the mare was at her very last reserve of strength. Not her neck and her shoulders merely were wet, but the sweat was standing in drops on her mane, her head, her sharp ears, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. But he knew that she had strength left, more than enough for the remaining 500 yards. It was only from feeling himself nearer the ground and from the peculiar smoothness of his motion that Vronsky knew how greatly the mare had quickened her pace. She flew over the ditch as though not noticing it. She flew over it like a bird. But at the same instant, Vronsky, to his horror, felt that he had failed to keep up with the mare's pace, that he did not know how, made a fearful, unpardonable mistake in recovering his seat in the saddle. All at once his position had shifted, and he knew something awful had happened. He could not yet make out what had happened, and when the white legs of a chestnut horse flashed by close to him, and Mahotin passed at a swift gallop, Vronsky was touching the ground with one foot, and his mare was sinking on that foot. He had just time to free his leg when she fell on one side, gasping painfully, making vain efforts to rise with her delicate, soaking neck. She fluttered on the ground at his feet like a shot bird. The clumsy movement made by Vronsky had broken her back. But that he only knew much later. At that moment he knew only that Mahotin had flown swiftly by, while he stood staggering alone on the muddy, motionless ground, and Frau lay gasping before him, bending her head back and gazing at him with her exquisite eyes. Still unable to realize what had happened, Vronsky tugged at his mare's reins. Again she struggled, and her shoulders setting the saddle heaving, she rose on her front legs, but could not lift her back, and she quivered and fell. With a face hideous with passion, his lower jaw trembling and his cheeks white, Vronsky kicked her with his heel in the stomach, and again fell to tugging at the rein. She did not stir, but with thrusting her nose into the ground, she simply gazed at her master with her speaking eyes. "Oh," groaned Vronsky, clutching at his head. "What have I done?" he cried. "The race, it's lost, and my fault. It's shameful, unpardonable. My poor, darling, ruined mare. What have I done?" A crowd of men, a doctor and his assistant, the officers of his regiment, ran up to him. To his misery he felt that he was whole and unhurt. The mare had broken her back, and it was decided to shoot her. Vronsky could not answer questions, could not speak to anyone. He turned, and without picking up his cap that had fallen off, he walked away from the race course, not knowing where he was going. He felt utterly wretched. For the first time in his life he knew the bitterest sort of misfortune beyond remedy and caused by his own fault. Yasmin overtook him with his cap and led him home, and half an hour later Vronsky had regained his self-possession. But the memory of that race remained for long in his heart, the cruelest and bitterest memory of his life.